All right. So I don't think you could have a course on serverless without discussing what serverless is. The reason for that is because serverless is a bit of a confusing term. If you think about it, if you hear serverless, it makes you think, oh, there are no more servers. How can it work then? The reality and what I call the truth about serverless is that no, not only is your question legitimate, but the reality is that there's still servers with serverless computing. And the reason it's called serverless computing, it kind of gives the story a bit away. Because what serverless computing is, it's related to something called functions as a service. And functions as a service is basically on-demand computing. So you upload code to a cloud provider. Here, we're mainly going to be talking about AWS. And that code runs in response to an event. Once it's done running the code, it returns a response, and everything that was used to run that code gets taken down. The reason serverless caught on as a term was because we never talk about servers. Servers are just not something that you take into consideration. You upload code, you run it in response to an event, and then a response gets generated. That's it. So you'll never have to worry about anything server related. What version of Linux is it using? What's the underlying hardware? None of that is important. The only thing that's important is basically your code and how that code gets run. That's it. So no more worrying about bandwidth, hardware, scaling, security updates, the whole thing. That's something that's out of your sphere of concern. So that's where the term serverless came from. But we're going to dig a bit deeper and try to understand how serverless actually works in the context of PHP, but also with WordPress. So how does PHP work? If you're not super familiar with the inner workings of PHP as a language, basically the way it works is your browser will send a request to a web server. Usually it's either Nginx or Apache. And in response to that request, that web server will call the PHP interpreter and that will run your script. Since Ymir is mainly about WordPress, it's going to run the WordPress script and that will return HTML output back to the web server, which then sends it back as a response. So that's the idea really simply about how a PHP application works. Now, how does a serverless PHP application work? Well, it's kind of like the same behavior, but instead, we swap out a lot of parts that you would have on your server with services from your cloud provider. So instead of having a web server, you now have an API gateway that receives the request from your browser. And then the API gateway converts that into an event. Remember earlier I mentioned that serverless computing is running code in response to an event. So the API gateway sends the event to the serverless PHP runtime, which will do the same thing as the PHP interpreter did. It will run the PHP code, WordPress or otherwise, generate an output, and this output will be converted into a result that the API gateway can process and return back as a response. So that's simply what's happening with serverless PHP. Now, the question often is, why would I use this? What's the advantage of switching my infrastructure to something more, it's not necessarily more complex, but it's not something you're familiar with. So the main advantage with serverless is that it scales. And we're going to talk about that just in a bit when we start talking about WordPress architecture with serverless, but you basically have no limit to scaling. So that means that if you need a lot of computing power for your WooCommerce stores or your LearnDash course or your EDD licensing server, you have basically infinite computing power at your fingertips. So that's one of the main reasons why it's really powerful. A lot of people use serverless because they don't have to worry about scaling. But not only do you have to not worry about scaling, you don't also have to worry about server stuff because there's always server things to think about. There's server updates, keeping your server secure. If you get hacked, cleaning things up. There's just a lot of things that you worry about that you don't want to have to worry about when you think about servers because it's not your area of expertise. You don't want to pay somebody thousands of dollars to do that. So that's one of the main advantages. And then there's a cost advantage too. At the low end, If you're using DigitalOcean, obviously you can't get something as close to $5 a month for a droplet with serverless. But when you start thinking about those large servers that you over provision because you need to be ready for the worst case scenario, but most of the time the server is not doing anything, there's an advantage here because a lot of what serverless is pay per use. If your website doesn't receive any traffic, then you're not paying for anything. You only pay for what you use. In the case of a WordPress site, if you're paying a hosting provider several $100s a month, but really you only get a lot of traffic at specific times, and really the rest of the time the site's not doing much, you might actually save a lot of money because of that. Because now you're only paying when there's actually something happening. So there's a cost advantage to that, but it only starts when you pay $50, $100 a month for your hosting. But a lot of these things that we're talking about, you also get with WordPress hosting. So there's a legitimate question to ask yourself, which is, why would I want to do this and not pay a WordPress host? Because the promise of WordPress hosting is I won't have to worry about updates. I won't have to worry about my site going down. I won't have to worry about a lot of things because they take care of it for you for a fee. But the reality is that in practice, it's not that true. If you look at the pricing page of a WordPress hosting company, you'll see that there's a lot of limits. There's how many CPUs you get, how many PHP workers, and we'll get back to that in a second, how much RAM, how much bandwidth. All these things are actually important and you have to worry about them because what happens if I get too much traffic? Will I be able to handle that without having to go to a higher plan? Behind the scenes too, you still have a single point of failure. Everything is still usually on the same machine. Maybe the database is separated, your page cache also, but the server, the object cache are going to be together with the PHP workers. You might be co-locating with somebody else. So if somebody else is having a traffic spike, it might affect your site. You can still get unexpected maintenances and outages. So there's a lot of stuff that can still happen with WordPress hosting, even though you're paying to not have to worry about them. I think there's enough disaster stories about it. There's entire Facebook groups and Reddit threads dedicated to finding a right hosting company because those things, even though you're telling yourself that you're paying for that, that's not really what you're getting in practice. If we look at the difference now with serverless PHP. So serverless WordPress is very similar to how it was with just regular WordPress hosting. The only thing that changed is in the middle, we put the serverless PHP that we talked about before. But that serverless PHP actually ends up doing a really big amount of lift for you. So one, it can scale infinitely. You don't have to worry about, oh, if I get a huge traffic spike, will my server hold? It's not a problem. There's no actual server behind the scenes that's under duress. It's basically Amazon's computing power that's going to scale to handle whatever amount of traffic you're receiving. I've done load tests going from 0 to thousands of people checking out on an e-commerce store, and you wouldn't even know. It's because everything's separated. Each PHP worker is its own server. There's no single point of failure. Everything's been replaced with services. We'll discuss that in later parts of the course, but each part, the page cache, the object cache, the database, you're basically separating those into different AWS services that are much more resilient. That's what a lot of the hosting companies do behind the scenes as well, but only for their enterprise programs. With serverless, this architecture is required even for the smallest sites. So even if you have a blog or a small site that you get like a couple of dozen visits a day, it doesn't matter. The architecture is going to be the same as an enterprise. And if for some reason you got Reddited and you got an huge traffic influx, you wouldn't have to worry about your site being down because of it, because serverless will allow you to scale to handle that amount of traffic. All that you have to do is you have to pay your AWS bill each month. That's it. And that's the big difference between the two. It's that you get peace of mind knowing that whatever happens, things will work. And that's not something that's always guaranteed with different WordPress hosting companies. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't trade-offs. I think if you come from a background where you're used to dealing with a server, so you're used to being able to SSH in, FTP, modify files, do all those things, you'll learn later in the course that those things aren't always possible with serverless. There are trade-offs that you would make, but it's nothing that you wouldn't be unfamiliar with if you use a host like Pantheon, or if you're used to a more enterprisey workflow where you might not have access to the server. You're not supposed to have access to the server. It's a security risk. You won't be too surprised by how serverless works. But if you come from a background where you're used to having a lot more control and things like that, you will definitely see a difference, because your ability to do things that are customizable is harder to do. But those are trade-offs. And like any time that you would evaluate a hosting provider, there's always trade-offs to take into consideration. And it's not any different than now. And we'll discuss more of those in later section.